Willie Nelson is not just a country music legend. He is a living monument to pain, resilience, and the quiet poetry of rebellion. That gravelly voice once gave the world "On the Road Again," a song that captured the restless spirit of wanderers, the bittersweet ache of endless highways, and the beauty of a soul that never stops moving forward. But behind that warm, familiar melody lies the story of a man who has weathered storms far fiercer than most could imagine. For over 7 decades, Willie has stood steady through betrayal, collapse, and losses so deep they could hollow out a soul. And yet, each wound became a verse, each scar a thread, woven into the fabric of music that now beats in the hearts of millions. He didn't just survive, he transformed disgrace into dignity, silence into anthems, and grief into grace. Now at the age of 92, when most people have long since laid down their burdens, Willie still walks headlong into the wind, carrying a quiet strength and a fire that refuses to fade. Behind that calm, knowing smile rests a weight almost no one can fathom. And the final years of his journey may hold truths more haunting, more beautiful, and more human than anything that came before. So don't look away, because what Willie still endures might just be the most powerful chapter of all. And if his music has ever stirred something in you, perhaps it's time to see and honor the man who has given the world everything and still hasn't stopped giving. Some hearts are born with cracks too deep for childhood to ever mend. Long before the world heard the gravel in his voice or the aching beauty of On the Road Again, Willie Nelson was just a small, forgotten boy in the dusty fields of Abbott, Texas. Born in 1933, he was abandoned almost before he had the chance to belong anywhere. His mother was the first to vanish, disappearing like smoke on a wind-blown day, leaving no note, no farewell, no trace except the ache she left behind. His father, struggling to hold his own life together, remarried and soon disappeared too. Willie was just a baby, too young to understand betrayal, but already old enough to feel its sting. Left with nowhere else to go, he and his sister Bobby were taken in by their poor but kind-hearted grandparents. 2 people who did their best to patch the holes in the hearts of children no one else had stayed to love. It wasn't neglect, it was survival. But survival often comes at a cost. His grandfather, a blacksmith with calloused hands and a quiet strength, became the first person to place a guitar in Willie's small hands. That man was his anchor, his hero. And then, when Willie was just 6 years old, pneumonia took him away. The loss was devastating. It shattered what little sense of safety Willie had clung to. In his autobiography, he would later write words heavy with a child's truth. Our separation from Mother and Daddy seemed worse than a death because they were still out there in the world. But they weren't with me and Bobby like they were supposed to be. How impossibly cruel for a boy to know his parents were alive, yet utterly unreachable. The pain was more than grief. It was the raw, relentless wound of abandonment. While most children cry for parents who are simply away, Willie cried knowing his would never come back. By the time he was 7 in 1940, Willie wasn't playing with toys. He was holding on to a guitar as if it were the only lifeline he had. He didn't learn chords for fun. He learned them to quiet the storm raging inside his chest. At 9 years old, while other boys played barefoot in the dirt, Willie was standing in smoky local bars with the Bohemian Polka Band, trading childhood for survival. He sang gospel in church, but even there, his songs were not pleas for salvation. They were cries for someone, anyone, to hear him. Every stage he stepped onto, even as a child, was less a performance and more a desperate attempt to connect. The music that would someday soothe millions was born in those sleepless nights when he would stare at the ceiling and silently ask himself why love always left. Even decades later, that question would haunt him. In interviews, he would admit, there was always that silence. I filled it with song because no one else was talking to me. The Texas sun burned his skin as he picked cotton with bleeding fingers, and hunger gnawed not only at his stomach, but at his heart. By adolescence, he had already buried more dreams and endured more goodbyes than most grown men. Yet somehow he kept singing, because if he didn't, the silence might have swallowed him whole. The Texas sun does not simply shine, it punishes. And for a teenage Willie Nelson, that punishing heat became a part of his daily ritual. Bent over the cotton fields, his back aching, his fingers blistered, he worked not for ambition, but for survival. By the time he was just 14, around 1947, Willie had already cycled through more jobs than many adults twice his age. He trimmed trees, worked as a phone operator, bounced rowdy drunks at nightclubs, sold encyclopedias door to door, spun records as a disc jockey, scrubbed dishes in greasy kitchens, patched saddles for ranchers, climbed telephone poles, and peddled books to families so poor they didn't even own a couch to sit on. Later, he would recall one job with a bitter smile. I was selling a $600 set of encyclopedias to people who couldn't afford a decent meal. It didn't feel right. But when you're young, broke, and chasing something as fragile as a dream, you take what you can. During the day, he worked. At night, he played in small bars, spinning country tunes on dusty turntables and singing for coins. He slept wherever the night left him. Sometimes on floors, sometimes in his car, sometimes not at all. And when he dared to chase the Nashville dream, the city's gates slammed shut in his face over and over again. No record label wanted him. No producer saw potential. No one promised a thing. There were only closed doors and heavy silences. Then came a night so dark it almost became his last. In his 20s, living in a broken-down trailer near a cemetery outside Nashville, weighed down by rejection, failure, and too much whiskey just to quiet the ache, Willie wandered out into the road, a usually busy street, and lay down in the middle of it. He didn't do it for drama. He did it because he didn't know what else to do. Cars swerved around him as if he weren't even there. Life didn't flash before his eyes. There was only silence. Later, he would write, "Was I relieved? Was I disappointed? Can't say for sure. All I know is I got up, walked back to the bar, and had another drink." That is not the kind of story that ends in applause. But sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is simply stand back up. And Willie did. Not because he saw hope, but because he could not bear to quit. One night, broke, without a car or a place to sleep, he tried hitchhiking to Portland, Oregon to find his mother. No one stopped. So he curled up in a ditch beside the highway, his guitar next to him, rain soaking his clothes, wondering how much lower life could go. Then a truck driver pulled over. He gave Willie a ride and $10 for a bus ticket. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A lifeline handed to him by a stranger. Willie would later call those years a long storm, a storm without shelter, without compass, without applause. But somewhere in that storm, he found the raw truth that would define his life. Music was all he had, and it would have to be enough. Some men write history. Willie Nelson wrote its soundtrack long before the world even knew his name. By the late 1950s, after years of picking cotton under the cruel Texas sun, trimming trees to keep food on the table, and scraping by as a DJ and dishwasher, Willie was still holding onto his guitar like it was oxygen. He played in dimly lit nightclubs, mailed out demo tapes, and scribbled lyrics late into the night, words that would one day become pillars of American music. But back then, no one was listening. In 1959, broke and living in a modest Houston apartment with a baby on the way, Willie wrote a gospel ballad called Family Bible, inspired by the memory of his grandmother singing hymns at the dinner table. Desperate to buy groceries, he sold the rights to the song for just $100. It became a radio staple and a hit for Claude Gray, praised for its purity and timeless spirit. But Willie's name never appeared on the label. The applause belonged to someone else. That pattern would repeat. He penned Crazy, a haunting melody born from the deepest recesses of longing, which soared into immortality through Patsy Cline's voice. He wrote Funny How Time Slips Away, which Billy Walker recorded. He gave Roy Orbison Pretty Paper. These weren't just songs. They were the emotional architecture of a generation. Yet to the average listener, Willie Nelson was invisible. While his words poured from jukeboxes across America, he was serving drinks, not signing autographs. When he tried to sing his own songs, producers scoffed. His voice was too rough, too raw, too weathered. He didn't have the right look. No pompadour, no rhinestones. Just braided hair, gentle eyes, and a face that told the story of every mile it had traveled. Nashville didn't hear the soul in the gravel or see the poetry in his weariness. They wanted polish. Willie brought truth, and for that he was told he didn't belong. Imagine writing the soundtrack to someone else's success while being told your own story wasn't worth hearing. It wasn't just rejection, it was erasure. While other artists climbed the charts on his words, he walked dark streets searching for secondhand guitars and sympathetic ears. He worked tiny radio shifts, played backup in smoky honky-tonks, and taught Sunday school just to scrape by. With each song he gave away, a little more of himself disappeared into someone else's fame. For most, this would have been the final verse. But for Willie, it was only the silence before the storm. By the early 1970s, Nashville had quietly decided he didn't fit. RCA dropped him. Critics dismissed him. His ranch in Ridgetop burned to the ground in a fire that felt more symbolic than accidental, as if the industry itself was erasing him from the map. At 39, broke and bruised, he could have vanished, but instead he drove back to Texas, where a different kind of stage was waiting. Austin in the early 70s was a beautiful, lawless crossroads where hippies and cowboys shared bar stools, where no one cared how you looked, as long as your song was honest. Here, Willie was not an outcast. He was an outlaw. In 1973, he released Shotgun Willie, a ragged, unapologetic album that didn't care for radio approval. Critics were puzzled. Fans felt it in their bones. Phases and Stages came next, widening the crack in Nashville's walls. Then in 1975 came Red-Headed Stranger, a bare, ghostly concept album so sparse that Columbia Records thought it was a mistake. But it was pure Willie, and the world leaned in to listen. The record went multi-platinum. That same year, alongside Waylon Jennings, Jesse Coulter, and Tom Paul Glazer, he created Wanted, The Outlaws, the first country album to ever go platinum. Willie wasn't chasing stardom anymore. He had built his own stage, his own movement. The outlaw wasn't hiding anymore. And for the first time in his life, the world finally looked up and listened. Just as Willie Nelson was rising from the ashes of rejection, a different storm was building, one that no spotlight could shield him from. At the time, he was still married to Shirley Cawley, his second wife, a singer who had stood by him through long nights on the road and even longer silences in the dark. Their marriage was already fragile when, one quiet afternoon, Shirley opened an envelope by mistake. It was a hospital bill, not addressed to her, but bearing a name she recognized instantly. The charge was for the delivery of a baby girl, born to Mrs. Connie Nelson. Shirley didn't need to ask questions. The truth was printed in black and white. When confronted, Willie tried to soften the blow. "It's not a big deal. Just a hospital visit," he said. But the bill said otherwise. Finally, in a low, resigned voice, he admitted, "Connie's my girlfriend. Paula's our daughter." It wasn't just betrayal. It was the kind of truth that cuts so deep no apology can reach it. The marriage ended. Willie married Connie, but the cost of that union would linger for decades, in headlines and in guilt. Later, with a mix of humor and weariness, he would say, "There's no such thing as ex-wives, only additional ones." At the same time, tragedy struck elsewhere. His beloved ranch in Ridgetop, Tennessee, a place he had poured his heart into, burned to the ground. His marriage was gone. His label contract was gone. Nashville was gone. At just 40 years old, Willie found himself emotionally bankrupt, spiritually hollow, and sitting in the ruins of everything he had tried to build. He admitted later there was a moment when he considered walking away from music entirely. Not because he stopped loving it, but because he feared he no longer had the strength to survive it, and yet, something inside him refused to die. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the voice of the boy who once clutched a guitar in a church pew, believing music could still heal. Whatever it was, it pulled him back onto the stage, even with a broken heart and a conscience weighed down by regret. This was the essence of Willie Nelson. Not just the voice, not just the songs, but the way he could bleed quietly, walk through fire, and somehow keep singing. But the flames that took us home also burned away the last illusion of stability in his life. By the early 1970s, Nashville had pushed him out like a worn page from a forgotten book. And while Texas welcomed him back with open arms, he knew deep down that every stage he stood on carried ghosts he could never escape. When Willie Nelson returned to Texas in the early 1970s, he wasn't coming home in triumph. He was returning with nothing but his scars and the faint hope that music might still be worth it. Austin wasn't offering him record deals or a gilded stage. Instead, it offered something far rarer: freedom. It was a place where long-haired hippies strummed beside weathered cowboys, where rednecks and radicals sat shoulder to shoulder in dimly lit bars, where music wasn't polished in studios but born raw, under starlit skies and the haze of beer and sweat. It was chaos and harmony in equal measure. And in this wild, unruly world, Willie felt something he hadn't in years. He felt at home. No longer trying to fit Nashville's mold, Willie began to write and sing like the man he truly was. In 1973, he released Shotgun Willie, an album that didn't beg for radio play or critical approval. It was sharp, unpolished, unapologetic, a mirror held up to his own life. Critics were unsure what to make of it, but the fans? They understood. They felt it in their bones. The crack widened with phases and stages, a heartbreak concept album that felt like ripped out pages from his own diary. And then in 1975 came Red-Headed Stranger. Columbia Records thought it was a mistake. Too quiet, too sparse, too strange. But that was the point. It didn't sound like anything else. It sounded like Willie. The album whispered instead of shouted, and the world leaned in to listen. It went multi-platinum. That same year, Willie joined forces with Waylon Jennings, Jesse Coulter, and Tom Paul Glazer to record Wanted, The Outlaws, the first country album to ever go platinum. Suddenly, the man Nashville had dismissed became the face of a movement. He grew his hair long, wore what he wanted, smoked what he pleased, and played like a man reborn. He wasn't clawing his way back into the spotlight. He was building a new one, on his own terms, with his own hands. By the dawn of the 1990s, Willie had done the impossible, risen from the ashes, redefined country music, and become an icon of outlaw soul. But just as the world began to believe he'd weathered every storm, another one rolled in, this time not with fire or heartbreak, but with an official letter bearing 3 cold letters: IRS. In 1990, the U.S. government claimed Willie owed $16.7 million in unpaid taxes, the result of years of financial mismanagement, bad advisors, and blind trust. Agents raided his home, seized recording equipment, and even took Trigger, his beloved guitar. For most people, it would have been the end. But Willie didn't fold. He did what he'd always done. He turned to music. In 1992, he recorded the IRS tapes, Who'll Buy My Memories, selling it directly to the public through late-night infomercials. It was stripped down, unpolished, painfully honest. America responded. Fans bought the album. Not out of pity, but out of love. Dollar by dollar, the debt was chipped away. By the mid-90s, most of it was paid, and Trigger was back in his hands. It wasn't a triumphant comeback orchestrated by a record label. It was a grassroots resurrection, the kind only a deep, unshakable bond between an artist and his audience could make possible. For most artists, the battles Willie Nelson faced would have been enough to end a career. But for Willie, every loss became another verse in a song he refused to stop singing. The deepest cuts in his life did not come from failure or rejection. They came from faces he would never see again. On Christmas Day, 1991, while the world was unwrapping gifts and sharing meals, Willie received the call no parent should ever get. His firstborn son, Willie Nelson, had passed away. Billy had been working on a gospel album, a fragile reflection of faith, but behind closed doors, storms no one could calm had been raging. Willie later admitted in the simplest, most devastating words, "I've never experienced anything so devastating in my life." There was no melody for that kind of silence. Every Christmas since has carried that shadow. An empty chair at the table, a wound that music can dress but never heal. In February 2020, Willie lost Paul English, his drummer, bodyguard, and brother in spirit. They had met back in 1955 when Willie was still sleeping in cars and playing for change. Paul became more than a bandmate. He was a protector, a steady rhythm in the chaos. After his death, Willie's daughter called him the co-patriarch of their family. When Paul's beat stopped, something in Willie's world fell silent too. 2 years later, in 2022, Willie's sister Bobby, his first duet partner, his lifelong musical companion, passed away. Together, they had survived abandonment as children, learned music side by side, and shared the stage for decades. When she died, Willie lost not just a sibling, but a living archive of his life's earliest memories. Then, in 2024, Chris Christopherson, fellow highwayman, poet, and friend, passed away at 88. Willie was now the last surviving member of the legendary outlaw supergroup. He stood alone, carrying not only his own stories, but the weight of theirs. At 92, Willie's health has been tested again and again. Decades of smoking left him with emphysema, forcing him to quit tobacco and eventually marijuana, switching to edibles to ease the pain. In 2015, he underwent a stem cell procedure to help his lungs. His gait is slower now, his frame leaner, but his eyes still hold the mischief, wisdom, and fire of a man who refuses to fade. He spends much of his time on his ranch in Spicewood, Texas, a $3 million refuge where wide skies and open fields give him the quiet he has earned. Family is at the center of his life now. His children, especially Lucas and Amy, share the stage with him, carrying the Nelson legacy into a new generation. Financially, the man who once lost everything has rebuilt his fortune to an estimated 25 to 30 million through touring, royalties, and his successful CBD line, Willie's Remedy. Yet he still rides the same tour bus, wears the same old boots, and plays Trigger, the scarred guitar that has been with him through fire, debt, and decades on the road. In April 2025, he released his 76th solo studio album, The Last Leaf on the Tree, produced with his son Micah. Critics hail it as one of the most profound late-career works in country music, a reflection on aging, loss, and letting go, yet filled with warmth and grace. Willie has no fear of death. "I don't hurt anywhere. I don't worry about dying," he told the press. After a lifetime of storms, he has made peace with time. He still tours. He still writes. He still laughs under the Texas sky. If you have ever tapped your foot to one of his songs, wiped away a tear during one of his verses, or found yourself humming on the road again on a long drive, then you carry a piece of him. Because some voices never go silent. Some hearts never stop singing. And Willie Nelson, outlaw, poet, survivor, will keep singing until his very last breath.